right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Once again, good morning. Thank you all so much for joining. This is the fourth summit as part of this series, and it's been really incredible. I've had the chance to be a part of the past three, and just the amount of information that you end up taking away and learning in such a short amount of time is really inspiring. And I think as a student, one of the coolest things to see is the conversations that really do come out of this. So as we go through until about 11:30 or so, I really do encourage all of you to converse in the chat section, utilize the raise hand feature, speak up and really ask as many questions as you can, because I can assure you we have some really incredible speakers lined up for this morning. But yes, again, thank you all so much for volunteering your time this morning to be a part of these really exciting and engaging conversations around consumption-based GHG accounting. So our goal at the end of this summit is to identify any concrete action items that cities and counties and this region can take essentially to really address the climate crisis, and also how we can continue to build a just, renewable, and resilient plan of action. So I'm going to introduce some of our really incredible speakers. I had the chance to meet with them beforehand, and again, truly inspired by their work. First of all, we have Chris Jones, who is director of the Cool Climate Network and also UC Berkeley Research Consortium, developing data and tools to engage individuals, businesses, and communities in climate action. Jones holds a PhD from UC Berkeley's Energy and Resources Group and is currently serving his 12th year as a program chair of the Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference. So Chris, thank you so much for being a part of it. Also, next we have Ben Gould, who is the president and co-founder of the Eco Data Lab, a technology and consulting company. The Eco Data Lab is partnered with the Cool Climate Network to make CCN's tools and research widely available to the public, helping governments better understand their carbon footprints and empowering organizations and communities to take action on reducing their environmental impact. In addition to his work with Eco Data Lab, Ben also volunteers with the Fossil Free California and City of Berkeley's Environmental Commission, working on environmental policies at the state and the local level. And finally, we have Brian Reyes, who is the Climate and Sustainability Planner with the City of San Francisco's Department of the Environment. Brian coordinates and collaborates with city agencies and external partners to conduct the city's sector-based and consumption-based GHG inventory, as well as steward city's climate action plan as part of the department's climate program team. Brian remains active in the community, organizing around labor issues and divestment, and implements sustainable agriculture and youth empowerment programs in more disenfranchised rural communities abroad. So I'm going to pass the mic on over to Chris Jones. I will stop my share, Chris, and then you can go ahead and start yours, if that's fine.
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. It's pleasure to be here. It's also, of course, a real concern to be here, as Debbie mentioned earlier in the plenary. The urgency could not be more real, and it's going to take really action on all of our parts, and urgent action. So let me see if I can share my screen here. Great. So I'm going to be talking about some tools that we've developed over the years to engage individuals, households, businesses, organizations, and communities in climate action. I'm just going to go through this very quickly. So it's going to be kind of a fire hose of potential ways that you can engage at all these spheres of influence in climate action. So at Cool Climate Network, as you sort of mentioned, we're the research consortium at UC Berkeley, so we focus a lot on our research. We've been doing this since 2005 when we were founded, and we have a lot of papers and research on our carbon footprint analysis in particular. We developed these data into online tools like the carbon footprint calculators to engage individuals or businesses or communities in climate action. And then we develop programs as well. So I'm going to talk about all of these things. The way we think about this is really engaging people at all of their spheres of influence. So we want to, people, when they first become concerned about climate change, as I did, they want to understand their own personal contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. But also, of course, once you have done that, you realize that you're pretty limited in your ability to solve this problem. So it becomes important to engage at the interpersonal level with your peers, at your places of work, within your community, and through public policy. We all have influence on all of those areas, and it may be that one of these other areas is the best way for you to engage. So let's start with the individual scale. This is the carbon footprint of the typical US household. This is from my master's thesis way back in 2005. It's gone down by 15% or so, which is good, but it's roughly looks like this still. And we've done some updates to it. So when you show people the typical carbon footprint, you often get some surprises. People may not realize that all the emissions embedded or in the life cycle of the goods and services that we consume are the largest part of our impact on the planet. And we often hear about our direct emissions from fossil fuels or maybe our electricity, but there's a lot of emissions associated with everything that we do, every dollar that we spend. Just to put this in perspective, here's the typical global carbon footprint, roughly. We've done an update on this too. And this also represents 80% below reduction, 80% reduction below 1990 levels. So this is our target for California as well. So from here to here by 2050, and then at that point, we'll only have achieved global average emissions. Globally, we need to get to this level of emissions, 80% below that, in order to stabilize the climate. So the urgency, again, as I mentioned, is real. We have to do this very quickly. So here's a typical US carbon footprint. If you live in California, it maybe look very different. This is the average California carbon footprint. You'll see electricity went way down and travel went up. And then if you live somewhere else in the United States, if you have coal-based electricity, it could look very different. So we've done a lot of work recently, in particular with San Francisco and the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, to get these carbon footprint estimates down to neighborhood scale. And this is what it would look like. Well, this is from one of our papers for the San Francisco Bay Area. We can see a 4 times difference in the size of carbon footprints between just one neighborhood and the other. And then if you were to go out to the entire United States, you can see even more differences. So it's not only the size of the carbon footprints, but it's also the scale of the composition of those carbon footprints. Like you may have more transportation emissions in the suburbs, makes sense, and lower emissions from transportation, for example, in the urban core. What that means is that the opportunities that different cities and different parts of your community within cities have different opportunities to reduce emissions. So just a bit on the details of the data. How we do this is we take all the information that we know about locations, and in this case, census block groups, and we use that to estimate carbon footprints. We use econometric analysis for this, but basically to give you here an example, here are 4 factors that we use to estimate vehicle miles traveled. And you can see that vehicle ownership is a lot lower down here in the financial district, downtown area of San Francisco, compared to these outline areas. In fact, that it's red means it's even higher than the California average. Same thing with household size, not too many people per household here, but a lot of people per household down in this lower area. And then income kind of varies, but you see population density also follows that same pattern. And so when you put this all together, it's no surprise then that the downtown area has very low carbon footprint per household compared to some of these outlying areas. And then we can extend this to all of the Bay Area. So you might want to take a look at where you are here. And you can see this kind of pattern of low carbon footprint on a household level in the kind of the urban core areas, and then higher carbon footprints in the outlying areas. Also important to note that all of the cities, even if they're outlying cities, do have low carbon footprint kind of urban core areas as well. So this is getting into the data here a little bit more. One of the things I just want to point out in this econometric analysis is that each aspect of carbon footprints, which is kind of in the rows here, different variables contribute differently. So for example, household size, more people in your household means more consumption of food, more consumption of clothing. The size of your home is going to affect things like how much you spend on utilities, how much stuff you have in your home. One I think that is kind of surprising and a little fun to look at is college education. So controlling for these other variables, that is people with the same income level and same household size and the same home size, by having a college degree, they tend to spend more on things that basically are associated with social status. So education, eating out more, entertainment, travel. And so there's a positive correlation between education and emissions. Bit unfortunately, as you might think. So we can, again, scale these to the entire United States. Here's a paper we did for the whole US. So we did the consumption-based carbon footprint analysis of every zip code in every city and every county in the US using this methodology. Again, you see this really similar pattern across the United States. And we use that information to develop now tools to engage households. So this is a screenshot of the carbon footprint calculator, the Cool Climate Calculator. So you put in California, you might get it, well, you will get an estimate that looks like this. This is from a little bit more updated analysis. You can put in your city. So here's Berkeley. You can put in specific zip codes. So this is where the students live, which is kind of fun. And you can see it's a lot lower. Food is the largest part of their carbon footprint. Many students, of course, don't even have cars, but this is assuming kind of average for that zip code. And then this is where the professors live, up in 94708. In fact, it actually is off the chart. I have to readjust the chart even to get it to fit. Here's back to the California average. It makes a big difference, the number of people in the home and your income. So if there are a lot of people in the home and a low income, you see that food is a much larger part of the carbon footprint. Whereas if you have very high income and only one person in the household, food is now a small part of your carbon footprint. You really need to look at your travel and your overall consumption. So one exercise I think that's really interesting is to take the average carbon footprint in California and say, what would it take to reduce emissions to 40% below by 2030 in 10 years? What would the typical household have to do to get to our target for California? So that means getting down from 44 to 26 tons or 27, somewhere around there. And then 50% would be 22 tons. So let's go through that exercise. So one thing you might want to do is you go through the tool and you see your transportation page. Well, let's get one vehicle, make it an electric vehicle. And that did a lot of reductions. Now we're down to 37. We might want to say to our other vehicle, again, with this, we have to do some pretty serious lifestyle changes. So let's reduce the miles from that vehicle in half. On our energy, one of the easy options is to enroll in community choice energy, which most Bay Area households are now in, and get the 100% renewable option. We still have a ways to go. We have 5 more tons to go. So we have to do something about our natural gas. Let's put heat pumps for all of our water heating and our space heating. Again, a pretty big change, and we still have a few tons to go. Now we have to get into our diet and say reduce by half the consumption of meat and dairy. All of that is what would be required in the next 10 years just to meet our 2030 target. We need to continue on a process to reduce our emissions. So on a household basis, you may have to address your shopping next, and actually reduce the amount of consumption of goods that you use by using a number of strategies to purchase more long-lived goods, to purchase goods that are less often, recycled content goods, etc. Then you can build a climate action plan. So it's important for people to understand how their contribution to climate change and specifically what they can do. And next, I'm going to talk about organizations. Just do a time check here. Content, okay, we're doing pretty good. So at the organization level, I really recommend, first of all, I'm going to be talking about behavior change and how to influence others. And if you want to learn about how to influence others to engage in behavioral change, I really highly recommend the Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference. This year it's happening virtually. December 3rd through 8th. And this is really the place to understand how behavioral sciences can be used to influence behavior in policy and in programs. This has been going on for 12 years. Geez, I'm losing track now. I think it's, I've been involved for 12 years, so since 2007. I'm going to tell you about a program called the Cool Campus Challenge. This goes back to a program we did at Cool Climate years ago called the Cool California Challenge, where we engaged dozens of cities in tracking their carbon footprints of households and in a competition to be the coolest California city. We ran that for 3 years with the California Air Resources Board. This is a class that I taught for 3 years at Berkeley on behavior and sustainability. We have the BET conference. We've done a lot of research on behavior change. Here's a paper interviewing programs that have done similar work. And we came up with these 20 strategies to engage individuals in climate action. I'm not going to go through these. There's so many things that strategies that can be used. You just have to use them effectively, whichever strategy you're going to choose. And basically, we can sum it all up into making it simple, fun, and social. But you have to really understand the barriers preventing people from taking actions and how to reduce those barriers or remove them entirely. And then understand what motivates people to take that action of all the people who do it, and try to enhance the motivations and decrease the barriers and make it, again, a simple, fun, and social program. So here's the Cool Campus Challenge. And the way we decided to do that in this program was we wanted to engage all 10 University of California campuses in a behavior change program, and a simple, fun, and behavior change program. This is actually one of the most successful behavior change programs in the country. We engaged 22,000 staff, student, and faculty. That was about 7% of all the students across all campuses. And what I'm really proud of in this program is they took, on average, over 9 actions each. So it's not that we just got them to sign up, is that they're very engaged in this program. We had our goals to activate, educate, motivate, and empower individuals to reduce emissions and build capacity. The only thing I want to say about this is you have to design your program with metrics that you are going to use to evaluate your success, and then devise specific strategies to engage people or to meet all of these objectives. So here's our software. What it does is it's based on the premise that everybody does something to be low carbon. And in fact, everybody does not just one thing, but they do a lot. Nobody's kind of like the worst person at everything, like, like drives the Hummer every place they go and has their lights on all the time. I mean, people engage in sustainability because, of course, it's practical. But of course, most people in California, and research backs this up, are actually concerned about climate change and want to reduce their energy and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And so we use this program to enable people to share the actions that they're taking. So they can select from a number of different actions. We have about 60 or 70 actions that they can choose from. And they upload a photo of the action. We have a little prompt. It tells them, they have to write a little story about what they did. And then it goes into this activity feed. It's like an Instagram style activity feed that's very active during the program, just getting people to share their ideas. That is a really powerful way we found to engage people. Not only does it get them, empowered to take more action, but it really empowers, it makes them feel like they are contributing to the solution. So their self-efficacy, as we call it, increases. And the way that it increases is through a group. So as an individual, you cannot solve climate change, but you can make your business more sustainable. You can make your community more sustainable. As a group, collectively, we can make a really powerful and meaningful impact. And that's really critical to engaging people in sustainability. So you can click on any of the user profiles. There's a scoreboard on the left for individuals. You can join teams. You can see how your whole campus is doing. Again, here's the scoreboard. We are highly successful with this program. We got thousands of people at all the campuses to join. In closing, I'm going to go to the policy in the community sphere, and I'm going to turn this over to Ben in just a second. We also develop tools to identify the largest reduction opportunities for communities. One of the things that we found in this recent paper is that 1/3 of the total emission reduction potential in California requires local governments to be involved. It requires local government policy and local government intervention, and it requires households and businesses to participate. And so we cannot solve this alone just through technology and state and national level policy. So one thing you can do in this tool, you can go to coolclimate.org/scenarios, and you can put in your city or even your zip code or neighborhood, and you can see which opportunities hold the most potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. One of the things that we found in urbanized areas is the largest opportunity is just to put more people in your city if your city is a low carbon city. So moving more people to San Francisco is the best thing that San Francisco can do to reduce its emissions globally from everything that we've been analyzed, because carbon footprints would be higher had those same households lived elsewhere. So I want to turn this over to Ben now to talk about EcoData Lab and how we're using these data to engage communities through professionally designed software and engagement platforms.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so at EcoData Lab, we're going to take all of the research Chris has done, looking at individual carbon footprints, scaling it up to community level, doing behavioral change work, and making those tools available for local governments and communities and organizations to apply at any scale to really understand where their personal responsibility, whether it's an organization or individual, for emissions comes from, and figure out what they can do to really effectively take action. As Chris was talking about before, it varies from individual to individual or household to household or community to community. And so we really need a targeted approach to figure out what's most effective and where it can be deployed. So we're working on taking this research and making it useful and accessible to anybody who wants to understand better their personal or their community's carbon footprint or their businesses or organizations. Chris, if you can go to the next slide, we've got a couple of quick graphs for you to look at. So we're deploying basically, first of all, a dashboard that'll help you dive into both the background metrics that inform a greenhouse gas inventory for a community, right? Total CO2 emissions, but also where it comes from electricity versus natural gas versus transportation and so forth, both for cities and for counties. And Chris, is the next slide similar?
LA here. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's more of the same. So if you go to the next slide. So we're looking at really having a whole suite of data available for the governments that are interested in it. So you can break down vehicle ownership in your city, see how these trends are changing over time, and really get the pulse of your city's greenhouse gas emissions and overall carbon footprints. And the other key thing we think about this being really helpful for cities is actually using data sets that respond over time to policy changes. One of the challenges we see with traditional inventories is that you might put in some new bike lanes and bus lanes, but because your city's metrics are based on the overall county statistics for transportation, you don't really see an impact locally. We're using different data sets like overall vehicle ownership trends in order to look at the actual VMT in a city. And so if you put in enough buses and bus lanes and bike lanes, people will stop owning cars, and that'll show up. So you'll have a more direct impact in terms of how your policies really drive what the data is showing you are your emissions, because it's all a lot of modeling and a lot of some guessing and trying to figure it out. So yeah, that's the direction we're going with EcoData Lab, and Brian Reyes will talk next about how some of this consumption-based emissions inventories are being applied in San Francisco. And I think we have an opportunity for a couple of quick questions maybe, or should we say those to the end, Yusra?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Chris and Ben, for that. I think we can maybe have one question and then we can move along. We will do our best to get all of your incredible questions answered. Some really exciting conversations. So one that I think is kind of relevant to right now is for Chris, but for both of you as well. Any work done on how the carbon footprint has changed as a direct result of the shelter-in-place policies and the pandemic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is quite a bit of research on this that's showing the percentages of total reductions from different areas. Of course, transportation is a huge one. Airlines have been way back. I don't have the latest data at my fingertips, but we know as the economy slows down, emissions are going to slow down. And the emissions are very highly tied to the economy. But when the economy bounces back, the question is, how is it going to bounce back? So we actually gave several workshops on this. We did one at the Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference. I've talked about this quite a bit. I think rather than, what's most important to me is how this affects people and how they think about their relationship to the environment, and how urgent problems, we've already experienced them and lived a crisis personally. How are we going to use that to build a more resilient and sustainable economy going forward, a regenerative economy? So I feel like this workshop and this task force is right on target, getting the message out. But we got to affect people's hearts. We got to and give them solutions. We have to not just overpower them and overwhelm them. We need to ultimately, engage and empower them with solutions.
Thank you so much. I think that definitely ties into the keynote as well about, anxiety and hope in a time like this. And I think it's worth to kind of take a look at a more specific case study in the city of San Francisco now. So Brian, we'd love to hear from you if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here for a second. I know my video is on, but I've been having bandwidth issues. I'm going to stop my video and just share the screen. So, as Chris mentioned, they did a consumption-based emissions inventory for not only for the city of San Francisco recently, but also for the air district. So we leveraged Chris's consumption-based emissions inventory to integrate consumption-based policy relevant actions into our climate action plan. So the following is my journey on how we integrated and continue to integrate CBIs into San Francisco's climate action planning process. We're currently going through our climate action plan update, so everything is not fully baked yet until early next year. But I wouldn't be remiss unless I start without the traditional inventory, because it's important to compare that. And we've been measuring our greenhouse gas emissions in San Francisco since 1990. So we refer to our inventory as a sector-based or traditional approach of accounting. And this traditional approach is constrained by and limited to emissions occurring within San Francisco's geopolitical boundaries. And this is what cities do all over. So this county approach has been used to establish our emission reduction targets and related climate policies. So for the purposes of tracking climate goals over time, we have been accounting for emissions from a frame, which honestly limits our scope to address climate change within the bounds of San Francisco borders. So here's our sector-based emissions that you usually see cities report. We're at 5.14 million metric tons, and the biggest share of emissions occur within the transportation and the building sector. And within the building sector, natural gas dominates that the usage and emissions. So from that foundation, we've, and my predecessors since 1996 have been working to establish bold goals and aggressive reduction targets. And in 2008, we established these 3 reduction goals. Well, actually, in 2008, it was 80% below by 2050, but recently we've committed to net zero by 2050. Currently, we are updating our climate action plan, and based on our emission pathway analysis, we're on pace to be in order to be on pace with 2050, we need to accelerate our efforts by reducing emissions 68% by 2030. So here's sort of the upshot on our progress, and we've been decreasing our emissions from a sector-based lens. 22% population increase, 172% increase in GDP, and decrease of emissions at 35%. But as we know, we are a metropolis, and cities have large demands and calls from the global product supply chain, and that's what we're talking about here today. So what we buy and consume in SF has emission impacts from resource extraction to the production to delivery of the products. And we realize that San Franciscans and cities have this opportunity as consumers to affect global markets and policy by making better purchasing decisions. In addition, we can also push producers, so it's not just us as consumers, but it's also producers to take more responsibility to reduce their emissions. Hence, it is important that we recognize that our footprint is beyond our borders. And here's some results that I pulled from Chris's study for us that hasn't been published. But essentially on the left there, we have our traditional inventory of 5.9 million metric tons in 2015. And based on this consumption-based emissions inventory, which we release soon, our emissions are about 2.5 million or 2.5 times greater than that. So what does that mean? Well, between 1990 and 2015, under the traditional inventory lens, we saw about a 26% decrease in emissions. When we switched to a consumption-based lens, we saw only about a 2.5% decrease in emissions. So with it, again, I don't want us to be stuck in, oh, wow, we should be doing so much better. It's more of what opportunities can we take advantage of now that this information is surfaced to address that larger emissions that we can affect. So how do we use consumption emissions data? But first, because we're in a transition to fully understanding consumption and the science of application of it, we're using two different lenses of emissions inventories, the traditional and the consumption-based. And so our climate action plan, which like I said, is being updated, is a good policy relevant tool to get our city to endeavor and bolster existing programs, incentives, and policies. So quickly, I'm going to rush through this pretty quick because of time, but the following is our story in integrating this consumption-based emissions policy in our climate action plan. But first, would be remiss if I didn't provide context that our climate action plan has to be Paris compliant. So what does that mean? It provides a clear roadmap of actions. It evaluates co-effects of actions, identifies clear roles and responsibilities of agencies, businesses, as well as community-based organizations and individuals, has a monitoring and verification plan, integrates mitigation and adaptation, and addresses racial, social, and economic inequities. So in the end, our goal is to have this all adopted by the Board of Supervisors by December 2020, but Plan B, like most of us have done during this COVID, if not C, D, and E, is our new legislative goal is to be pushed out to 2021. And some of you may know this 5 milestones of planning, which is basically the inventory, establish your emission reduction targets, develop your climate action plan, implement policies and measures, monitor and verify results, and then you continue the virtuous cycle. What we decided to do was to do the same thing using Chris's work in that yellow, inventory the consumption-based emissions, establish reduction targets, develop stable actions and strategies within the climate action plan. But Plan B was that we can't really establish those reduction targets currently, and so we will use the CAP update to surface the need to codify those targets thereafter. What we did to start off was establish a sustainable consumption working group. So our vision is to ensure that the city's mitigation actions are put forth in this climate action plan by engaging first city agencies as well as community-based organizations within this technical working group. And we use the CBI to target and screen certain product categories. In this case, we focus on building and embodying carbon, food, consumer goods and services, air travel, and residential consumption. There's so many other things out there, but we simply can't solve the world. So we had to focus, and we used Chris's work in order to hone in our focus. Then we used resource and literature through the USDA Sustainable Consumption Toolkit. So that gave us guidance when there's very little precedence for cities to implement sustainable consumption policies and programs. And so our technical working group, we established a shared understanding of consumption by defining what that meant for ourselves in San Francisco. Certainly Plan B is we underwent so much disagreement, and instead of calling it sustainable consumption, we called it responsible production and consumption, which you see the definition there. And a lot of it entails what we talked about, in addition to aligning with the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, number 12. Next, we profile and prioritize our emissions using a profiling tool provided by USDN and their Sustainable Consumption Toolkit. It's an Excel spreadsheet base, but what we did was we developed actions and strategies based on those 5 categories I talked about by doing a multi-criteria analysis and performing a rank consumption of categories. The upshot to this tool was that we first looked at behavior change mitigation instead of going straight from emissions to developing policy. So we prioritized sort of, we forgot what we thought were important to drive behavior change, and then we developed actions thereafter. Now, we did next was to refine those actions and identify a combination of new funded and ongoing existing programs and policies. And number 2 is to further prioritize was by massaging the language by doing further stakeholder engagement. So that stakeholder engagement continues to today. And it's the most time consuming because of the diversity of government, public, CBO, and business stakeholders needed to engage to get buy-in. Plan B, and believe me, there was so many plan Bs and still forthcoming. The moral of the story is when developing a climate action plan, particularly something new, like in our case, responsible production consumption, in general, you got to build enough time to account for plan Bs and be iterative and flexible. So here's sort of our process. And we started in 2019 with a technical group, did our inventory and profiled our actions thereafter. We finished up drafting our actions. Now we're in the middle of a racial and social equity assessment. I can dive in deeper to that, but just to have no time, but know that we are doing that on all our strategies and actions. And then we'll integrate that with a CAP, and we can do a public engagement and then monitor and verification framework and adopt our climate action plan by 2021. Okay, so here's our next steps in my final slide. After 21, we will be implementing these strategies put forth in our climate action plan. And because our CAP is Paris compliant, we will have to ensure that our process has buy-in with implementing city agencies, CBOs, businesses, and San Francisco residences. Last thing we want to do is to have this plan collect dust on the shelf. We want it to be implementable. And lastly, and Debbie had alluded to it in her opening clarity, because we view our climate action plan as shared with a larger community, it's not only the government holding ourselves accountable, but also we're asking San Franciscans in the community to do that as well. And we recognize that consumption through the lens of consumption-based emissions and integrated into our CAP surfaces this idea of behavior change. So we feel that by developing actions according to the process that we just described, we can more effectively engage with everyone and having and coming through with that idea of a shared goal and urgency to help us combat and adapt to the impacts of climate change. So thank you for your time, and I'm not sure if we have time for Q&A, but I'll bring it over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Brian. That was a wonderful presentation. And please do keep the questions coming. We will have maybe about 15 or so minutes for some Q&A, because there really are some incredible questions that I think will really get this conversation going. So one of the questions comes from Emma. Emma, would you like to unmute yourself, or I can ask it for you? I can go ahead and ask it. That's totally fine. So the question is, do you have recommendations for how to help lower income communities of color reduce their emissions without negatively burdening them? Or are we focused on pushing lifestyle changes in more privileged groups who might have higher consumption lifestyles? And kind of going off of that, how could we promote reducing consumption-based emissions to diverse communities equitably and successfully? So a question that really does tie in a lot of the issues that this summit has kind of gone through so far.
I imagine that was a question directed at me.
Yeah, I mean, any of
so that is the challenge, particularly given what's happened recently. And as I had in my slide, we're doing a racial and social equity assessment. And what that is a tool. It's not necessarily the solution, but what it allows us to do in all our strategies and policies, and we already took this through our natural gas ban ordinance, is it allows us to inquiry to make sure that we are impacting these 5 themes that we hold to be true, which is a combination of inclusive and empowerment, just transition, health, hazards and resilience, and gosh, I forget the other one, but everything that this conference is about and what you all know, we're looking to address that. Now, we don't pretend to have that solution and know that we're going to solve that, but this tool that we're using, at least in our climate action planning process, is helping us look at a deeper look.
I'd like to follow up on that a little bit. If you think about that map that I showed earlier with some communities are green and some are red, the ones that are green have already met what would be a per household target for 2030. And so the lower income communities tend to be in or more urbanized areas, tend to have, again, income and is associated with spending is associated with emissions. So certainly we if you want to prioritize the biggest reduction opportunities, it is typically higher income suburban households where the most opportunity lies. At the same time, there are programs available to low-income communities throughout California. So signing up low-income communities for utility programs that can provide a lot of free and low-cost resources to help low-income communities save money, I think is really important. And those are very often overlooked. There are also rebates and incentives that are specifically available, for example, for electric vehicles, and particularly in marginalized communities that have been identified through this screening tool that California has. But if you live in the Central Valley and are low income, you can get a free electric vehicle. So I think it's important to do the outreach to make sure that those resources are just being utilized. I would like to see a transition of funding from high income communities to low-income communities for climate action. There are many ways that you could think about doing that. So if you're going to build in a suburb, which is high income, you may have to pay some sort of a fee. And if you're going to build in a lower income community, you may receive some sort of incentive for that. So that would be a massive restructuring of the way we do climate, the way we do our taxation, but also the way we think about engaging in this issue. But we really need to think big. Bans are certainly a wonderful way to do this. Ben got me thinking about this a couple of years ago. Most of the solutions that we think about are very incremental. And now the types of solutions that San Francisco and Berkeley and other communities are thinking about are transformational. And so we need to think about transformational change like those bans, which will benefit ultimately everybody as long as they're done equitably.
Great, thank you so much. So one question comes from Nilong. Do local and state governments need to look at both production-based and consumption-based inventory when developing CAP? So kind of, I don't know if we can clarify.
Brian?
Sorry, do we need to? Yes. Should we? Yes. Is it required right now? No. I'm sure, Chris, we would love that to be required. And for Chris and his, for Ecodata Lab to do that for all jurisdictions in California. I will add to that is saying in terms of we should and need not only the state of California, but because our production, our global supply chain is global, I mean, the rest of the US, and if not, if we can scale the type of models that Chris and maybe other researchers are doing across globally, I think we can really understand who are the true offenders when it comes to emissions and from the consumption lens.
This is a question that just came in from Lucy. What advice do you have for implementing climate action in the workplace? So we'll get a different perspective here.
So we do have tools for that. So we have a business calculator. It's typically geared for a small business, but yeah, the same type of process. You want to understand your baseline, you want to set a target, you want to set some policies in place to achieve those targets, and then you want to track and monitor over time. really engaging the leadership, of course, is important, but also you can use behavior-based programs like ours. That competition I mentioned, that software is actually available for any business or any organization, any school, any group that wants to engage in a behavior change platform. We found that when we did that at the University of California and we focused it just on behaviors at the university, so lowering the university's carbon footprint, we had a 10 times return on investment. So if people did the action that they say they did and continued to do them as they said they were going to, it would really save a lot of money. You need to engage your employees and give them kind of credit for what they're doing so that they feel empowered to contribute to the solution. But a lot of times it's just investment. Go ahead.
Yeah, can I build on that? And not just within business as an organization, you draw your boundary around a city as well. I think a lot of this through the lens of Chris's work comes down to what we can do as individuals, and that what we do as individuals truly does have impact. And so this emissions tools certainly surfaces that. But in order to get at those individuals, it requires organizations to really do that marketing and outreach, really understand the behavioral science and apply it, do campaigns. It's a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of resources to do that. And I hope not only any organization puts more resources towards those type of efforts.
Let me give a quick plug to Interfaith Power and Light, because I see a question there about faith-based communities. They have a tool. You go to coolcongregations.org for any faith-based group. And in fact, any business could actually use it, their calculator there too.
Great. So one question just came in for Brian specifically. What type of goals do you envision using the consumption-based strategies? For example, can you foresee cities mandating a charge on meals or other goods with high associated gigs?
GHGs, there you go, yes.
There.
Got it. Is this from Kevin? He's my colleague. I just seen it right now.
Putting you on the
spot. So what type of goals and vision for the consumption-based lens? In terms of numerically, definitely consumption-based emission goals. In terms of goals like actions or strategies, policies, and programs, I don't know if I can, oh gosh, that's a hard one to face, Kevin. Mandating a charge on meals, I mean, I guess we have precedents for example, for health in San Francisco, we have Healthy San Francisco, which we charge a less than 1% tax on businesses of 20 employees or over. I'm probably wrong on that, in order to fund all sort of a quasi healthcare system for all residences of San Francisco. And I have been a personal user of that once upon a time, and it has been amazing. So, I mean, I could foresee it. I think what we've been talking about in this conference, in this opening plenaries, is that we're going to need massive change and these transformational changes in our systems to get the political will to do something like that. So we can service things in the climate action plan. I think a lot of these things are going to also take political will.
I just want to chime in there. This sort of touches on some of the earlier questions as well. I think a lot of the benefit of these analyses and these behavioral change tools is not just identifying what individual behaviors can be changed, but also opportunities for policymakers to develop policies to address these behavioral challenges or behavioral change targets, right? So maybe we don't want the city of San Francisco putting a tax on meat-based dishes. Maybe we want the California Secretary of Agriculture to develop a grant program to capture all the methane from the cows in California, for instance. And so finding opportunities for where the behavior change is a sticking point lets policymakers figure out other ways to solve the problem. So it's really just another tool for figuring out what kind of policies need to be passed. And then, maybe San Francisco wants to advocate for that because they can't really pass a meat tax locally, but they want California to reduce its agricultural emissions. And that gets them involved as a stakeholder statewide, when otherwise the city might not be too concerned about what's going on in the Central Valley or in Sacramento.
Definitely, and we can have maybe one more question similar to what Yale brought up, and also in general. So first of all, she does GHG inventories for the city of San Jose. Any suggestions on where she could start? And kind of more broadly, how can we make these strategies that you all presented this morning more financially equitable and accessible for the wide diversity of the Bay Area? Because not every city is as big as San Francisco is, or has that planning capacity. So if each of you can speak a bit to how that might look like in all of the counties.
Sure, I could touch on that. We're working on developing Ecodata Labs tools so that they'll be available for every city and county in California. And we're working on pricing models that make it accessible for cities and counties of any size and scale. Our goal is not to make this, expensive, hard to access. Our goal is to make it as accessible as possible to as wide an audience as possible and make sure we can keep doing the work. So we're looking at, pricing and funding mechanisms that enable us to keep moving that forward.
And I want to give a plug to Ecodata Lab as well as Cool Climate, and that what we get in return for what we funded is tremendous. We've supported them, and I know Stopway supported them, and other regional or local governments have supported them. And what they have and that scale, I think, feel like gives most bang for the buck. So, and I know that from the heart, Chris and Ben really want to, it's climate action. So they're doing whatever they can, whatever resources they can in order to provide this for cities. So I want to give kudos to them, and then that's a plug for City of San Jose as I go and engage Chris and Ben here. That would be my answer.
Thank you, Brian. We really appreciate your collaboration. It's just been tremendously helpful, and it's going to be helpful for all other cities because we've updated our methodology in a really important way. So the study that we just did for San Francisco is going to benefit all communities. So thank you for that. There was a question about equity, Yusra, and I didn't quite understand that. Can you repeat it?
I believe.
Was there the second part to your question?
Yeah, so it was financially accessible and equitable, and I think you may have touched on this.
Okay.
The low-income communities as well.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that is the goal. I mean, the goal is to really use data science to solve this problem. Whereas before, communities really had to do their inventories and treat it kind of like a management problem, like who's going to do this? How are we going to hire a consultant? How much it's going to cost? We just use data science to collect these inventories and just make it widely available. So that's what we're working really hard to do very, very well. But to go beyond that, I think Ecodata Lab's vision is not just to have the data, but it's really try to make tie policies to the data and to track that effect over time. So there's a lot of work to do.
Incredible. I think that's a great segue into the breakout rooms. So Lucy is amazing. She's going to be putting us all into more smaller, intimate sessions where we can really interact with our incredible speakers this morning for about 10 to, or longer than that, definitely 15 to 20 minutes. And I encourage all of you to continue asking questions during those breakout rooms, really get to know and get a feel of the tools that the speakers have been kind enough to share with all of us this morning. We'll wait for a few more people to trickle back in. Yeah, sometimes in the breakout sessions, we always wish we had more time. That's typically feedback. Yes, we were in it. I was in Brian's breakout room. Really incredible conversations going on, and I'm sure all of us can agree And yes, I think time is of the essence, but I'd love to hear from people in the other breakout rooms how the conversations went. Any one of you can maybe use the raise hand feature, or feel free to unmute yourself as well. We can kind of recap, and then we'll be returning to the main plenary in just about 10 or so minutes. Yeah, so maybe what about in Ben's breakout room? If anybody wants to kind of summarize what was talked about or has any questions.
Sorry, I can give a quick overview of what we were talking about. Not that I remember everything, but a few notes are Ben really emphasized that cities need to do consumption-based inventories first before they can start shaping policy, and also that not all emissions can really be addressed by city policy, that some will have to be addressed by state or federal or other policies, but there's definitely work that cities can do. There was a question about who else Eco Data Lab is working with. So far with San Francisco and Alameda County, but they're looking to grow their user base, and San Jose might be looking into that. There was a question about what kind of data are they using and where does that data come from? So a lot is from large-scale public data sources so that they can do, they can analyze consumption-based emissions for the whole state at once. And let's see, and then there was a discussion about flight emissions, many different reasons why it's very hard to regulate them, and just pointing out that they're really not captured very well in current inventories. And there was a little bit of a discussion as well about whether consumption-based inventories show kind of who's responsible. And Ben was saying that there's just many different ways to talk about responsibility, but that you can use them to find where you can work on policy.
Sounds really exciting. I can't wait to hear other sessions as well and other workshops in the main plenary, and kind of how that might tie into what we talked about this morning. In Chris's breakout room, does anybody want to kind of summarize what went over?
Chris keeps trying to nominate me to say something, so I will. Thanks, Chris. Not that I wanted to or volunteered, but here I am. So it was really talking about the need to use his data as a starting point, and to sort of relieve the burden from the cities of having to focus on the data, and that he can actually supply it and wants to. And so the question is how to engage both he and Ben in providing that for the cities and to have it available for everybody. And I think that about sums it up. Chris, unless you want to chime in.
Yeah, we had the same interesting discussion on responsibility, like who's responsible. But yeah, Delinda, thank you for your overview. I think everybody just wants to get involved and wants to, be as effective as possible. So I see a lot of need for collaboration, but kind of effective collaboration. So how do we utilize our resources? There were some consultants also on. So I kind of mentioned that the climate action plan process, the inventory should be kind of a small part. Collecting the data should be something that we can automate and use our data science and use our resources to get the data. We're trying to take that off the responsibility of cities and consultants, so that the consultants can do the hard work of actually writing the whole plan, and the cities can do the really hard work of actually implementing and tracking the plan. So I think, unfortunately, cities get stuck at just not even be able to make the first step. And we call that like the inventory should be step 0 on the planning process. It should just be there and available. And how do we do the harder work to implement it?
And I guess that brings up a question in terms of, and it's not a discussion, but it occurred to me that in the implementation, and if we're tracking that data, is that something you could help us do as well? Well, we update that data over time.
Yeah. Yeah. And so if you have a policy or a program with indicators that you want to track over time, we make it possible for you to add your own charts into the software. So add your own data. We'll help you put the data in there, and we can add your own charts into the software.
Yeah.
And those should ultimately, correspond with actual reductions. Yeah.
That's the goal.
Yeah. But a lot of times you might want to set indicators, just like a goal. We want to engage 20 businesses or 50 businesses, or we want to have this many schools doing this many meals, or whatever it is you happen to do that you want to track. We should just be able to have that part of a platform of indicators. So.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. From Brian's breakout room, I can give a few thoughts, and anybody else who is there, feel free to jump in. But it was really exciting. Brian, thank you for utilizing this Miro app. I've actually never used it, but it was a really great way of visualizing and kind of brainstorming some of the things that we talked about. One of them being, education. I mean, how can we continue to get people to understand the impact of food waste? And we talked about nutrition waste. And I think that ties in a lot with low-income communities and underserved communities, and gets us thinking about how that might look different in communities that don't have access to takeout or to food, and vice versa in more densely populated communities where there might be a lot more food waste seen. Also, we talked about focusing on operations and really reaching out to other communities that often aren't really part of this conversation. And it really does bring to mind in past summits where we did have representatives from a lot smaller counties actually talk about how, their lack of capacity in terms of organizing really served as a barrier when it came to things like transit or even housing. So it's really interesting to see those overlaps here. And then definitely food waste was a really big point of discussion. And also the question of how could we start, addressing consumption emissions. And I think that that's essentially kind of the goal of this morning and hopefully future conversations, is how we can engage our local governments into really implementing these policies. If there's anyone else, Brian, if there was anything I missed there.
Nope. Nailed it, soft landing. I do want to build upon, you were talking about engaging with those frontline communities that are going to be impacted by these policies or programs or whatever, or incentives. I'd like to, in the case of food, it is an interesting touch point, and because it's so basic to our human needs. So we can start there. I think when cities start to endeavor consumption-based climate planning, and with the frontline communities, in our case, it's interesting when I talked about that racial and social equity assessment that we did when we looked at food waste, and a lot of it was SB 1383 related, redirecting edible foods, getting an upstream generation of waste. We asked ourselves what considerations we need to take in place. And so what we were doing was proposing strategies and actions that were mitigating the problem, but not solving this systemic problem. And so what role do we have, or can we have, within the climate action plan, or as policymakers to do that? Well, we said, why think about what was it in the first place that caused this problem? Food insecurity. So moving further upstream on the systems change, like we got to address food insecurity, because that's clearly a need as we're looking at our strategies and supporting action. So it's really interesting when you start looking through that lens and you inquire deeply.
Amazing. Yes, absolutely. That just second to all of that. So we have about 4 minutes. I just want to, first of all, say thank you all so much. Truly 2 hours, and however long we've been here really does fly by when we're having these really inspiring conversations. So it would be great if the speakers can maybe drop their contacts or ways that people can continue to reach out to you in the chat. We will be returning to the main plenary. Feel free to do that there as well. And this presentation will be recorded, so all of the information that was shared this morning will be made available to you. And if it's not, please feel free to reach out to any of the facilitators on the task force or myself, and we can happily direct you to those resources because we'd love for you to have access to them. I will drop again the link to the document that we were kind of following along this morning, because those did have a few links that the speakers did share with all of you. So just in case you want to refer back to them, that would, that's all up to you. But yeah, that is pretty much it for this morning. Once again, thank you all so much for joining. I'll put the link to return to the main plenary now. This is often one of the most exciting parts, in my opinion. So we get to hear from all of the other workshops, what was discussed. And yes, we will see you all there. Thank you all so much once again. Yes, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, who will be reporting back to the main group?
Yeah, so if there is someone here that did a report back for the workshop that would like to speak up, feel free to jump in. Brian, Chris, and Ben, if you would like to also spend like a few seconds giving a rundown, that works as well. Yeah.
Okay, I nominate Brian or Ben, but we'll
I'm gonna say Chris or maybe Delinda.
Yes, Delinda. No pressure at all.
So Ben and Chris, did you want to just stay here for a second?
Okay, well, yeah.
We get back at 30. Is that our goal?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Okay, we'll see you all there.
Stay on a few minutes. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. So yeah, I think really honestly, either of you would be best at pulling this all together.
I don't know what happened. If you're what did you do? Did you just have a discussion in both your breakouts? How did you both do it?
Yeah, I mean, our breakout, they were really interested in knowing, like, how do we get our inventory? You know, how do we get the data? Yeah. Also, you know, we had this really question on like a responsibility, who's responsible for emissions. You know, I think the low income and equity stuff is always really important and kind of comes up. How do you engage, you know, which community should engage and how should you engage them? But really it was very practical. Like, it was like there were some consultants, like they want to do it climate action plans or cities, they want their data, they want to implement their plans. Like there's so much to do. How do we do it effectively? And that's kind of like what our conversation came down to.
Okay. Yeah, ours was similar. It was like open Q&A, responsibility, what's the data sources, how do we tackle, you know, aviation or, you know, retail stores or other problems, food consumption and so forth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And on my end, it was just two of us that were in there, so or two others other than me. And so we just talk about barriers to implement behavior change, policies and programs in our communities, and then what can we do to drive consumptive behavior changes, not so much solutions. I think the main thing, and you sort of touched upon it, was where can we start? One of the biggest challenges, where can we start beyond the inventory? And food was a common touch point. I think we can start with that. If communities don't have the capacity like we do to say, handle embodied carbon and aviation and you know, all these things, even though that's still focusing on certain specific categories, not everything, that we can start with food, particularly if we're trying to influence larger communities. So I think that was sort of the big thing, and a lot of it was in order to get those going is going to take, as always, funding and political will. I mean, these are things we know. So but let's hop back into the main room, and I actually think I will kick that can over to.
I think Ben. Honestly, I think you have like the best background. Yeah, I mean,
on both sides. You got it, Ben.
All right. Click the link.
Yeah, you're volunteering.
All right. See you there.
Okay. Ciao.